The Ant Hill Kids Cult: Ritual Abuse in Rural Canada. In the late 1970s, deep in rural Quebec, a small religious commune began to take shape. It did not begin with violence, it began with certainty. The kind of certainty that feels comforting when the world feels unstable. Its leader was a man named Roche Thériault. He was not charismatic in the theatrical sense. He was intense, soft-spoken at times, authoritative in small doses. He read scripture, quoted prophecy, spoke about purification and the end of days, and slowly, carefully, he positioned himself not as a teacher, but as an interpreter of divine will. The group would later become known as the Ant Hill Kids, but in the beginning, they were simply believers seeking separation from modern society. They wanted simplicity, self-sufficiency, faith uncorrupted by urban influence. They moved into rural isolation, wooded land, rough structures, a life removed from oversight. Isolation is the first tool of control. Distance from friends, distance from extended family, distance from external opinion. When people live physically removed from alternative viewpoints, belief narrows. It becomes reinforced by repetition. Thériault emphasized obedience. He preached that suffering purified the soul, that discomfort strengthened faith, that modern medicine was corrupt. He framed himself as healer, prophet, and spiritual authority. Members worked long hours, farming, building, manual labor. The physical exhaustion reduced resistance. Fatigue makes questioning harder. At night, he conducted lengthy sermons, interpreting scripture in ways that increasingly centered himself. He claimed divine visions, predictions, warnings. Over time, devotion became dependency. The group cut ties with outsiders. Children were raised inside the doctrine. Male contact dwindled. Visitors became rare. Inside the commune, hierarchy tightened. Thériault controlled food distribution, sleeping arrangements, relationships, marriages, intimacy. Control over daily life gradually expanded into control of identity. Members were told that doubt was sin, that questioning meant spiritual weakness, that leaving meant eternal condemnation. Fear replaced comfort, but not at once. Gradual control rarely feels like imprisonment at first. It feels like discipline, then obligation, then necessity. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling part is not violence yet. It is psychological narrowing, the moment when one person becomes the sole interpreter of truth. Thériault began claiming he could heal illness through prayer and physical intervention. Members trusted him. They had been conditioned to see him as chosen, as conduit. When someone became ill, he discouraged hospital visits. He insisted that faith and internal correction were sufficient. Over time, punishments for perceived spiritual failures escalated. He framed discipline as divine instruction. If someone doubted, they were corrected. If someone disobeyed, they were isolated. If someone resisted, they were humiliated publicly. Control through shame is powerful in closed communities, especially when salvation is framed as conditional. Children grew up believing this structure was normal. Women were told their obedience was sacred duty. Thériault asserted increasing control over relationships. He reassigned partners, broke marriages, established dominance over intimacy within the group. He claimed that God had granted him authority over reproduction.
Members internalized this through repetition, through sermons that lasted hours, through communal reinforcement. Outside the forested property, Quebec society continued normally. Cities operated, schools functioned, hospitals treated patients. But inside the commune, a parallel reality developed, one where external institutions were portrayed as corrupt, where Thériault's word overruled medical advice, where suffering was reframed as spiritual advancement. Over several years, that closed system intensified. Physical punishments increased, control expanded, fear deepened. But because it happened gradually, members adjusted incrementally. That is how high-control groups operate, not through immediate brutality, but through steady normalization. The Anthill kids became increasingly cut off. Supplies were limited, health deteriorated among some members, yet loyalty persisted because loyalty had been fused with identity. To leave would mean admitting belief had been misplaced, and psychologically, that is difficult. Thériault's sermons grew darker. He spoke about betrayal, about enemies within, about purification through suffering. He positioned himself as judge, as instrument, as the only barrier between his followers and divine wrath. The shift from preacher to tyrant did not announce itself. It unfolded, step by step. Isolation, authority, dependency, punishment. By the early 1980s, the commune led by Roch Thériault had moved even deeper into rural isolation in Quebec. Distance was no longer symbolic, it was physical. Dense woods, minimal neighboring properties, rough terrain separating them from ordinary oversight. The isolation was deliberate, because isolation removes comparison, and without comparison, behavior becomes normalized. Inside the commune, Thériault's authority intensified. He began referring to himself in biblical terms, suggesting he was chosen, an instrument of divine judgment. He reframed suffering as sacred. Pain became purification. Disobedience became rebellion against God, not just against him. That shift is critical in cult psychology. When a leader merges his authority with divine will, resistance becomes spiritually dangerous. Members were subjected to increasingly harsh punishments, public humiliation, beatings, forced fasting, isolation from the group. He would lecture followers for hours.
Often late into the night, sleep deprivation weakens resistance. Fatigue blurs reasoning. Repeated sermons reinforced one message: he was necessary. Without him, they would perish spiritually. Over time, Thériault assumed control over medical decisions. If someone was ill, he declared hospitals corrupt. Modern doctors were framed as enemies of faith. He claimed he could heal through intervention. At first, these interventions were minor, basic care, homemade remedies, but gradually they escalated into something darker. He performed unsanctioned medical procedures, without anesthesia, without sterile conditions, without training. Members allowed it because by then they believed his authority was divinely sanctioned. One woman reportedly suffered severe abdominal pain. Instead of seeking hospital treatment, Thériault performed crude surgery in the commune, using basic tools, no medical expertise. The outcome was fatal, but death was reframed as spiritual failure or divine will. Members were told that questioning the event was betrayal. Fear cemented obedience, and obedience reinforced his control. The group's internal structure became rigid,
Theriault decided who slept where, who worked where, who was permitted intimacy. He asserted sexual dominance over female members, framing it as divine instruction. Over time, his relationships multiplied, not as consensual dynamics, but as hierarchical imposition. Jealousy among members was punished. Attachment to anyone but him was discouraged. He centralized emotional dependency. This is a classic control tactic in closed communities. Reduce lateral bonds, increase vertical loyalty, make every member emotionally tethered to the leader. Children were raised within this structure. They witnessed punishments, heard sermons equating pain with salvation. Their perception of normal was shaped by repetition. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the most unsettling element is not a single violent act. It is normalization, the moment when what would once have been shocking becomes routine, when beatings are framed as correction, when unsanctioned surgery is framed as healing, when fear becomes daily background noise. Theriault's paranoia increased. He accused members of disloyalty, of spiritual impurity. He staged confessions, forced admissions of imagined sins, publicly shamed individuals to reinforce dominance. The commune became smaller over time. Some members fled, but leaving required courage and often secrecy, because Theriault threatened damnation and retaliation. Isolation meant escape routes were limited. Financial resources were scarce. Many members had cut ties with family. Dependence was not just psychological, it was practical. By the mid-1980s, physical abuse intensified. Women reported being beaten for minor infractions. Others were branded with heated objects as punishment. Some were restrained. The medical interventions grew more extreme. Unnecessary procedures, crude amputations, acts framed as purification. Each escalation tested boundaries, but boundaries had already eroded. Once the leader crosses one line without consequence, the next becomes easier. The group's internal logic justified suffering as spiritual elevation. Pain was proof of faith, and Theriault positioned himself as the gatekeeper of salvation. Authorities eventually began receiving fragmented reports. Escaped members spoke cautiously. Their stories sounded extreme, difficult to process. When people describe life inside high-control groups, their language can seem exaggerated to outsiders because the normalization inside those systems distorts scale. But slowly, law enforcement attention sharpened, and what investigators uncovered would confirm that the escalation had crossed into systematic abuse and homicide. By the mid-1980s, what had once been framed as discipline inside the commune led by Roch Theriault in rural Quebec had crossed into documented brutality. Former members who escaped began describing acts that were no longer ambiguous. Beatings were routine, sleep deprivation common, food sometimes restricted as punishment. Women described being forced into medical procedures conducted by Theriault without anesthesia or sterile equipment. These were not symbolic acts, they were physical violations carried out under the justification of spiritual authority. One of the most widely documented cases involved a woman suffering from abdominal pain. Rather than allowing outside medical care, Theriault performed an improvised operation. Accounts describe crude tools, no surgical training, no antiseptic conditions. The procedure caused catastrophic infection. The woman died. Her death was rationalized within the group as spiritual consequence. Members were instructed not to question it. Fear reinforced silence. Over time, The violence grew more performative. Public punishments increased. Members were struck with belts, fists, objects. Women were reportedly branded with heated instruments as marks of obedience. Theriault demanded confessions of imagined sins. Sometimes he dictated what the sin should be. Members repeated it back under pressure. The line between spiritual guidance and coercion disappeared. Children in the commune witnessed these events. They grew up understanding pain as part of religious structure. When authority defines suffering as necessary, resistance weakens. Isolation compounded everything. Deep in rural Quebec, the group had limited outside interaction. Escaping required not only physical departure, but psychological rupture. Leaving meant rejecting the belief system that had shaped daily life. That is not simple.
Especially after years of indoctrination. But cracks formed. A few members fled. They contacted authorities. At first, their accounts sounded extreme. Descriptions of branding, improvised surgeries, physical torture, multiple children fathered by Theriault within the group, control over intimacy, control over food, control over belief. But as more former members spoke, patterns aligned. Law enforcement began building a clearer picture. What had been dismissed as fringe religious isolation revealed systematic abuse. By 1989, the situation reached a breaking point. One of Theriault's partners managed to escape and report extensive violence. Her testimony detailed repeated assaults and medical mutilations. Police investigation intensified. When authorities intervened, the internal structure of the commune began collapsing. Members were interviewed individually, separated from the leader's immediate influence. Without his presence dominating the room, narratives shifted. Fear loosened slightly, and the scale of abuse became undeniable. Theriault was arrested and charged with assault and other violent crimes. Subsequent investigations uncovered additional deaths and severe injuries linked to his unsanctioned procedures and punishments. In court, the image of spiritual leader dissolved. What remained was a man who had exploited isolation and belief to dominate and harm. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling realization is not only that violence occurred, it is that it was gradual. There was no single explosive moment where followers suddenly recognized tyranny. It unfolded, incrementally. Each boundary crossed made the next easier. Each punishment normalized greater severity. The Anthill Kids commune did not begin as a death cult. It began as a group seeking religious separation, isolation, purity, community. But without external accountability, authority hardened. When one individual becomes sole interpreter of morality, dissent disappears. And without dissent, cruelty accelerates. Theriault was ultimately convicted of murder and other violent offenses. He received a life sentence. Years later, he was killed in prison by another inmate. The commune dissolved. Former members struggled to reintegrate into broader society. Many required long-term psychological support. Children raised inside the system had to relearn what normal looked like. The wooded land in Quebec returned to quiet. But silence is not the same as healing. What occurred there? The Anthill Kids case stands as one of Canada's most disturbing examples of cult-driven abuse. Not because it was immediate chaos,
but because it was structured domination. Spiritual language used to justify physical harm. Isolation used to prevent accountability. Authority used to reshape reality. When Roch Thériault was sentenced to life in prison in Canada for murder and assault, the legal chapter closed, but the psychological damage inside the former commune did not. The group that had once called itself a spiritual refuge dissolved under scrutiny. Cabins emptied, tools abandoned. The wooded land in rural Quebec returned to silence. But silence is not the same as healing. For survivors, the aftermath was disorienting. Many had spent years inside a system where one man defined truth, where suffering was reframed as purification, where obedience meant survival, where doubt meant damnation. When those frameworks collapse, identity collapses with them. Former members described difficulty adjusting to ordinary decisions, choosing clothing, managing money, seeking medical care without permission, reconnecting with estranged family. Control had not only shaped behavior, it had shaped perception. Children raised inside the commune faced an additional layer of challenge. They had witnessed abuse as routine, heard sermons equating pain with virtue, watched adults submit to domination without resistance. Undoing that conditioning required years. Some survivors required long-term therapy. Others withdrew quietly from public attention. Few wanted interviews. Many wanted distance from the name that had defined their lives. Thériault himself remained incarcerated until his death in 2011, when he was killed by another inmate. But by then, his physical presence no longer mattered to the group he once controlled. The damage had already been done. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the most unsettling element is not the brutality of specific acts, it is the mechanism. Isolation, authority, repetition, gradual escalation. The Anthill Kids commune did not begin with murder. It began with certainty. A man presenting himself as interpreter of divine will. A group seeking simplicity and spiritual structure. Distance from modern society. Then incremental shifts. Discouraging outside contact, framing doctors as corrupt, equating obedience to salvation, recasting punishment as purification. No single step felt catastrophic at first, but each step narrowed freedom. High-control groups thrive on insulation. When dissenting voices are removed, behavior recalibrates. What once would have seemed extreme becomes tolerable, then expected. Authority unchecked becomes distortion, and distortion over time can justify cruelty. The Anthill Kids case remains one of the most disturbing cult cases in Canadian history, not because it involved spectacle, but because it involved normalization. Medical mutilation reframed as healing, beatings reframed as discipline, branding reframed as devotion. Language became the tool. When language changes meaning, reality follows. For late-night listeners, the story lingers for a quiet reason. It suggests that control rarely announces itself dramatically. It accumulates. Through fatigue, through repetition, through trust placed in a single voice. The wooded property where the commune once stood no longer hosts sermons. No punishments echo at night. No leader dictates prayer. But the lesson remains. Isolation magnifies authority.
Authority without accountability distorts morality, and morality distorted long enough can justify the unthinkable. Thank you for listening.
Family murders, faith, fraud, and a house of lies. On the morning of May 5th, 2009, a quiet subdivision in Columbia, Illinois, was interrupted by flashing lights. Police cruisers lined the street. Neighbors stood in clusters at the edge of manicured lawns. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance to a home that just hours earlier had looked like any other. Inside, 3 bodies were found: a mother, 2 young boys, strangled in their beds. The father had called 911. His voice was urgent, controlled, but shaken. He said he had returned home from the gym and found his family unresponsive. Their names were Sherry Coleman and her sons Garrett Coleman and Gavin Coleman. Sherry was 31, Garrett was 11, Gavin was 9. The father, Christopher Coleman, told officers that threats had been made against the family. He insisted someone had targeted them. And in the house, investigators found something unusual. On the walls, written in red paint, were threatening messages. The words suggested religious hatred, references to faith, warnings that you have paid. It appeared staged to look like an extremist attack. But even in the earliest hours, something felt off. The home showed no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no pried doors, no clear disturbance consistent with a stranger moving violently through the house. Sherry and the boys were strangled with ligatures. There were no defensive wounds suggesting prolonged struggle. It looked controlled, deliberate, intimate. Christopher Coleman was not an unemployed drifter. He had worked as a bodyguard and security director for a prominent televangelist. His life revolved around public faith and protection. He was accustomed to discussing threats. He told investigators the family had received disturbing emails weeks prior, messages warning of danger, messages referencing religion. He claimed he had reported these threats. Neighbors recalled seeing police presence at the home days earlier. It seemed credible. But staged scenes often lean heavily into narrative, and narrative can unravel under scrutiny. In the days leading up to the murders, Christopher Coleman had been involved in an extramarital affair. Investigators would later uncover hundreds of messages exchanged with another woman. Messages discussing divorce, messages describing a desire to start over, messages that hinted at dissatisfaction with his marriage. But at first, however, the community believed they were witnessing a targeted hate crime. The red writing on the walls was visceral. It demanded interpretation. But the timeline raised questions. Christopher said he left for the gym around 5 a.m. He returned around 6 a.m. That window, 1 hour, was the alleged time of the attack. Yet no neighbors reported suspicious vehicles, no strangers seen entering or exiting. The subdivision was not isolated farmland. It was residential, close-knit. Even early morning activity tends to be noticed. Investigators examined Christopher's behavior. He appeared composed. He gave interviews. He spoke about faith, about protection, about loss. But composure does not equate to innocence, and grief manifests differently in different people. The crime scene writing became central. Handwriting analysis was conducted, forensic examination of paint strokes. The red substance was not blood. It was paint from inside the home. The messages were written on interior walls,
not scrawled in haste, but applied in strokes that seemed measured. A stranger committing triple homicide and then calmly staging religious messages inside the house would require time. Yet the estimated time of death aligned closely with Christopher's morning absence. No alarm system had been triggered. No security camera footage revealed intrusion. The garage door had not been forced. If an intruder entered, it was through an unlocked access point, or with a key. The boys were found in separate bedrooms, Sherry in another. The killer moved room to room. Strangulation requires proximity, hands on cord, pressure maintained. It is not distant violence, it is personal. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the tension lies in contradiction. A father who reports threats, a staged hate message, no forced entry, a narrow timeline, and an affair unfolding quietly in parallel. Christopher Coleman's communications with his mistress would later become critical. In text messages, he described marital dissatisfaction, spoke of wanting freedom, mentioned life without financial burden. Life insurance policies on Sherry added another layer, substantial sums, enough to reset a life. But in the early hours of May 5th, none of that was publicly known. All the public saw was a father on the front lawn, 3 bodies inside, red words on walls, faith invoked as motive, and a town shaken. In the hours after the murders in Colombia, investigators did what experienced homicide detectives always do. They worked backward. The walls bore red messages meant to signal religious extremism, threatening phrases, references to punishment. But staged scenes often lean heavily into explanation, and explanation invites scrutiny. The first major question, entry. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass, no pried doors. The Coleman home was not left open overnight, and according to neighbors, nothing unusual had been seen in the early morning hours
of May 5th. If an intruder entered, he either had access or moved invisibly. The second question, timeline. Christopher Coleman told police he left for the gym around 5 a.m. Surveillance footage later confirmed his presence at a gym in a neighboring town. But footage timestamps became critical. Security cameras showed him arriving later than he initially reported and leaving earlier than expected. The gap narrowed. Digital breadcrumbs matter. Phone records showed that Christopher had sent a text message shortly after leaving the house, a routine message, but forensic analysis would later suggest that his phone activity during the morning contradicted portions of his initial statement. Investigators also examined the threatening emails he claimed to have received weeks earlier. These emails referenced violence, religious anger, warnings of harm. They had been sent from anonymous accounts, but when forensic specialists traced IP addresses and account creation data, something emerged. The emails were linked back to computers associated with Christopher. The narrative began to shift. The threats may not have been from an external extremist. They may have originated inside the marriage. At the same time, detectives uncovered the affair. Hundreds of messages exchanged between Christopher and another woman. Intimate messages, future-oriented messages, discussions of divorce, financial constraints. One message described wanting a fresh start. Another referenced life insurance. Life insurance policies on Cherie Coleman totaled substantial amounts. Combined with child policies, the potential payout exceeded $1 million. Money is not always motive,
But motive rarely ignores money. The digital evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Christopher had searched for ways to create anonymous email accounts. He had sent messages to himself, posing as threats. He had reported those threats to local police prior to the murders. This established a paper trail, a preemptive explanation. If harm came to the family, it would appear externally motivated. But the writing on the walls complicated that illusion. Forensic analysis showed the red paint used in the messages came from inside the home, a container stored in the garage. The brush strokes were steady, deliberate. There were no fingerprints from unknown intruders, no foreign DNA, only the absence of struggle. The strangulation method itself is revealing. Strangulation is quiet. It leaves minimal external noise, but it requires proximity and sustained pressure. The boys were found in their beds. There was no sign they had left their rooms, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds suggesting prolonged fight. Cherie was found in another bedroom, also strangled. No signs of forced sexual assault, no evidence of ransacking. The house remained orderly. The killer moved calmly from room to room. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the emotional center tightens around intimacy. Strangulation is not distance. It is hands or cord near skin. It is seconds stretching into minutes. It is looking at someone while they lose consciousness. That requires emotional detachment or resolve. Investigators reconstructed Christopher's movements on May 5th, minute by minute. Phone records, gym entry logs, surveillance footage, vehicle data. The more they aligned the timestamps, the less room there was for an unknown intruder. The alleged hate threats began to look like scaffolding, a narrative built in advance, a story constructed to survive initial questioning. But stories fracture under forensic light. When confronted with inconsistencies, Christopher maintained innocence. He insisted someone had targeted his faith, that the threats were real, that an intruder had entered. But without forced entry, without unknown DNA, without witness sightings, the theory weakened. The affair intensified suspicion. In messages to his mistress, he described dissatisfaction with his marriage, spoke of stress, financial concerns, and a desire for a different life. Divorce would have been costly, public scandal damaging. Life insurance offered liquidity and sympathy. Family annihilation cases often follow similar arcs. The perpetrator seeks escape from responsibility. Financial pressure compounds emotional dissatisfaction. Rather than separate, they eliminate and stage. By late 2009, investigators had enough to charge Christopher Coleman with the murders of Cherie and his sons. The staged hate crime theory collapsed under forensic light. The emails he claimed were threats had originated from accounts he created. The IP traces linked back. The timeline aligned too tightly. The gym alibi narrowed. The house showed no sign of external intrusion. The red writing became less a warning and more a performance.
As investigators built their case against Christopher Coleman, the pattern that emerged was not chaotic. It was structured, and structure is often more disturbing than rage. Family annihilation cases rarely erupt without warning signs. There were usually stress fractures beneath the surface, financial strain, marital dissatisfaction, extramarital attachment, reputation risk. Christopher's life had begun to split into two narratives. Publicly, he was a husband, father, and security professional tied to a prominent religious ministry. Privately, he was deeply involved in an affair. Text messages between him and his mistress revealed increasing emotional distance from his marriage. He described his wife, Cherie Coleman, as controlling in some exchanges. He spoke of wanting out, of starting over. But divorce is expensive, especially with children, and in his case, public image mattered. A high-profile separation could damage professional standing. Life insurance, however, provided a different path. Policies covering Cherie and the boys were active, substantial payouts, enough to erase debt, enough to build a new life. Investigators uncovered evidence that Christopher had searched online for ways to make emails appear anonymous. He had created accounts from devices linked to him. The threatening messages, framed as religious hate, were sent from those accounts. He had then reported those threats to law enforcement weeks before the murders. That act is critical because it shows pre-staging. He planted the seed of external danger. He established the narrative before the crime occurred. When family annihilators stage scenes, they often over-explain. They want investigators to see motive immediately. But authentic hate crimes typically include chaos, forced entry, graffiti applied in haste, external damage. In the Coleman home, the writing appeared deliberate, the brushstrokes controlled. The paint came from inside the garage. There were no foreign footprints, no broken locks. The digital evidence became the backbone of the prosecution. Phone pings, computer logs, IP address tracking, gym surveillance timestamps. The timeline narrowed around the early morning hours. Christopher left for the gym, but the window between estimated time of death and his verified location grew uncomfortably tight. Strangulation leaves physical markers, petechial hemorrhaging, ligature impressions. Autopsies confirmed that Cherie and the boys had been strangled manually or with ligatures. The boys were attacked in separate rooms. There was no evidence of prolonged struggle, which suggests surprise, sleep, or trust. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the hardest element to confront is proximity. Strangling a stranger during a robbery is horrific. Strangling your children requires something colder. It requires calculation that overrides instinct. Investigators also reviewed Christopher's behavior immediately after the murders. His 911 call was urgent but controlled. He emphasized the threatening messages, directed attention toward an external extremist narrative. He mentioned prior police involvement due to threats. It sounded rehearsed. As the investigation tightened, Christopher maintained innocence. He denied writing the emails, denied staging the scene, denied harming his family. But digital forensics does not rely on emotion. It relies on trace. IP logs tied the threatening emails to devices in his possession. Search histories aligned with planning. Affair communications revealed motive. Financial records showed potential gain. The mask began to slip. Community reaction shifted from sympathy to disbelief. Neighbors who had stood beside him during the initial shock reevaluated memories. Friends questioned conversations from weeks earlier. Faith community members struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the charges filed. Family annihilation often carries a secondary shockwave. The idea that the protector is the perpetrator destabilizes trust more deeply than external crime, because it suggests danger from within. The prosecution would eventually argue that Christopher chose annihilation over divorce, that he preferred sympathy over scandal, that he staged hate to misdirect. The defense maintained that evidence was circumstantial, that digital traces could be misinterpreted, but as the layers accumulated, the picture hardened. This was not a random extremist attack. It was a controlled internal act. The red writing on the walls became symbolic not of hate crime, but of calculated deception.
The house in Columbia returned to quiet, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of absence. 3 bedrooms empty, a yard unchanged, neighbors passing by with a different understanding of what had occurred inside. When the trial of Christopher Coleman began, the narrative the prosecution presented was simple in structure, even if devastating in implication. There had been no masked intruder, no religious extremist, no unknown enemy scaling fences before dawn. There had been a husband and father inside the home. Digital evidence, forensic timelines, financial records, and staged threats converged into one argument. The danger originated from within. The threatening emails, once framed as external hostility toward faith, were traced back to accounts he created, IP addresses linked to devices in his possession. The red writing messages on the walls, meant to imply ideological hatred, came from inside the garage. The gym alibi narrowed the time window rather than expanding it. The affair messages painted motive. Divorce meant public failure and financial burden. Life insurance meant liquidity and sympathy. Family annihilation cases often follow a chilling psychological path. Control over narrative is prioritized over preservation of life. Christopher did not snap in visible rage. He constructed an explanation before the crime. He reported threats weeks earlier. He laid groundwork. That planning became one of the most damaging elements of the prosecution's case. Jurors were shown messages in which he described wanting a different life, a life free from marital strain, a life without what he framed as emotional suffocation. Yet instead of leaving, he allegedly chose elimination. The verdict came in 2011, guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no future restart, no insurance-funded second chapter. The courtroom conclusion provided legal resolution, but legal resolution does not erase the image of 2 boys in their beds, of Garrett Coleman and Gavin Coleman losing their lives before adolescence was complete. Nor does it soften the image of Cherie Coleman strangled in her own bedroom. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the most unsettling detail is not the red writing.
It is the ordinariness of the house. A suburban home in Columbia, Illinois. Neighbors mowing lawns, school buses arriving in the morning, a kitchen table where homework was once done. Family annihilation feels uniquely disturbing because it collapses the boundary between protector and predator. There is no forced entry, no broken glass, no external chaos, only a door closing behind the person who lives there. Christopher Coleman's case fits a broader pattern seen in similar crimes: financial pressure combined with emotional dissatisfaction, an extramarital relationship offering perceived escape, public image complicating separation, and the belief, however distorted, that eliminating family is a solution. But elimination is not escape, it is exposure. The staged hate crime narrative might have succeeded briefly if digital forensics had not traced the emails, but modern investigations leave fewer shadows: IP addresses, cell phone data, search histories, timestamps. Technology dismantled the fiction. The red writing meant to redirect suspicion became evidence of planning. In the years since, the Columbia subdivision has returned outwardly to routine. New residents move in, children ride bikes, mailboxes stand upright. But houses remember, not physically, but socially. Neighbors carry stories, communities absorb lessons.
The Coleman case endures not because of spectacle, but because of deception layered over intimacy. A father who called 911, a staged threat invoking religion, a narrative designed to protect reputation, and beneath it, calculated violence. When the lights go out and houses settle into quiet, the story lingers for a reason. It reminds us that the most dangerous narratives are sometimes the ones built in advance, that staging often reveals more than chaos, and that proximity does not equal safety. Thank you for...
The disappearance of Maura Murray, the crash, the road, and the vanishing. On the evening of February 9th, 2004, a single car sat angled into a snowbank along Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire. The road was dark, rural, quiet in a way that swallows sound. Snow lined the edges of the pavement in uneven mounds from previous storms. The Saturn sedan had struck a tree. Its front end was damaged, the windshield cracked, but there was no one inside. Less than 10 minutes earlier, witnesses had seen a young woman standing near the vehicle. She appeared shaken, but not visibly injured. She declined help, and then she vanished. Her name was Maura Murray. She was 21 years old, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, an athlete, quiet, disciplined, described by many as private. In the days before her disappearance, there had been signs of strain, but nothing that pointed clearly toward what would happen on that snowy road. On February 5th, 4 days before the crash, Maura had broken down at work. She worked as a security guard on campus. During her shift, she reportedly received a phone call. After the call, she became visibly upset. When asked what was wrong, she reportedly said only, "My sister." There were no immediate details beyond that. The next day, Maura searched online for directions to northern New England, Vermont, New Hampshire. She looked at lodging options, vacation rentals. She emailed professors saying she would be absent for a week due to a death in the family. There was no death in the family. She packed clothing, withdrew nearly all of the money from her bank account, approximately $280, purchased alcohol from a liquor store, Bailey's Irish Cream, vodka, Kahlua. She left campus that afternoon in her black Saturn. No one has confirmed speaking to her after she left. By early evening, her car was traveling north through New Hampshire. The weather was cold, roads partially icy. At approximately 7:27 p.m., a neighbor named Butch Atwood heard a loud thump outside his home along Route 112. He looked out and saw a car against a snowbank. He drove his school bus, he was a local bus driver, to the scene. Maura was standing beside the vehicle. He later described her as appearing cold but composed. She told him she had already called roadside assistance. He did not see her using a phone. Cell service in that area was unreliable. He offered to call police. She declined. He insisted he would call anyway. He returned to his house and contacted authorities. By approximately 7:46 p.m., the first police officer arrived. The car was empty. The airbags had deployed. The interior contained personal belongings, some alcohol containers, her cell phone, her wallet. Her keys were not inside. There were no footprints leading clearly away from the scene. Snow covered much of the surrounding area, but the terrain was uneven, wooded. If someone had walked into the forest, tracking would have been difficult. The window between Atwood leaving her and police arrival was small, roughly 10 minutes. In that window,
Maura Murray disappeared. No confirmed sighting of her has been established after that point. Investigators initially treated it as a possible DUI walkaway. Perhaps she feared getting into trouble for alcohol in the vehicle. Perhaps she wandered into the woods and succumbed to exposure. Search teams deployed dogs within days. They tracked her scent briefly along the road eastbound for about 100 yards. Then the scent stopped abruptly. Some interpret that as entering another vehicle. Others argue scent tracking in winter conditions is unreliable. The Saturn itself contained items that raised questions. Printed MapQuest directions to Burlington, Vermont. A rag stuffed in the tailpipe, a trick her father had reportedly suggested to reduce smoke from a mechanical issue. Her bank account was empty. Her dorm room was packed up as if she did not intend to return immediately. The emotional strain in the days before her disappearance has been analyzed repeatedly. There had been a minor car accident days earlier in Massachusetts. She had reportedly been disciplined at West Point years before for shoplifting and credit card misuse. But none of these incidents directly forecasted disappearance. The more investigators examined her last known movements, the more fragmented the picture became. Why drive north alone? Why withdraw nearly all available cash? Why tell professors about a false death? Why bring alcohol? Why refuse assistance from a neighbor in a rural area? Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the road itself becomes part of the mystery. Route 112 is narrow, curving, surrounded by dense forest. At night, headlights illuminate only a small stretch ahead. If someone intended to disappear, it is a place where darkness assists. If someone intended harm, it is a place where isolation protects. The absence of footprints remains debated. Search crews combed nearby woods extensively in the days following. Helicopters scanned from above. Volunteers walked grid patterns. No clothing, no remains, no trace. Some theorize she accepted a ride from a passing motorist. Others believe she ran into the woods to avoid police and became disoriented. Some believe she staged the crash intentionally. Others reject that entirely. The case has generated podcasts, documentaries, online forums dissecting every minute detail. But strip away speculation, and what remains are simple facts. A car crash at 7:27 p.m., a witness conversation, a refusal of help, police arrival 10 minutes later, an empty vehicle, and snow absorbing sound. The silence after 7:46 p.m. is what defines this case, because silence creates space, and space invites theory. But no theory has replaced evidence. Maura Murray remains officially missing. Years have passed, the road remains, the snow returns each winter, and the question lingers in the cold air. Where did she go in those 10 minutes? In the days after February 9th, 2004, the disappearance of Maura Murray did not immediately become national news. It began as a local missing person case in rural New Hampshire. A college student who crashed her car, possibly fled the scene, possibly wandered into the woods, possibly waiting to resurface. But she did not resurface. Within 48 hours, search operations intensified.
New Hampshire Fish and Game officers combed the woods surrounding Route 112. Tracking dogs were brought in. One bloodhound, purportedly given a glove belonging to Maura to establish scent, followed a trail eastbound along the road. The dog tracked approximately 100 yards, then stopped abruptly. The scent did not continue into the forest. It did not circle back.
It simply ended on the pavement. That detail has fueled debate for 2 decades. Some investigators interpret it to mean she entered another vehicle, a passing car that picked her up, voluntarily or otherwise. Others caution that winter conditions, snowbanks, vehicle exhaust, and road traffic can distort scent tracking. Still, the abrupt ending is one of the most unsettling pieces of the puzzle. If she ran into the woods immediately, why was no scent trail found leading inward? If she walked down the road, why was she not seen by passing drivers? Police canvassed the area extensively, but Route 112 at that hour is quiet, sparse traffic, long stretches of darkness between homes. The nearest houses were separated by yards of snow and trees. If someone stopped briefly, no one else may have witnessed it. Maura's father, Fred Murray, traveled north almost immediately after learning of the crash. He had spoken to Maura days earlier about the Saturn's mechanical problems. The rag in the tailpipe, later discovered at the scene, was purportedly a temporary measure he had suggested to reduce visible exhaust smoke. Fred arrived determined to search. He retraced the crash site repeatedly. He walked the roadside himself. He pushed for expanded search operations. In the meantime, investigators examined Maura's activities in the days before she left campus. On February 7th, she attended a dorm party. There was alcohol. Later that night, she crashed her father's car in Hadley, Massachusetts. The accident caused damage, but no serious injuries. Police were involved. Insurance was notified. The incident added stress. Then, on February 9th, she withdrew nearly all the money from her account, approximately $280, leaving only a few dollars behind. She purchased alcohol, Bailey's, vodka, Kahlua. She emailed her professors, stating there had been a death in the family and she would be gone for a week. There was no death. She also emailed her employer. Then she left. These actions suggest planning, but planning what? A private retreat? A short escape from stress? A longer disappearance? There was no suicide note, no final message, no public declaration. Her dorm room appeared partially packed, some posters removed from walls, textbooks boxed. Investigators debated whether this indicated intention to transfer schools or simply organization. Nothing definitive emerged. The emotional moment at her campus job days earlier remains ambiguous. After receiving a phone call, she reportedly became distressed. When asked what was wrong, she said only, "My sister." Her sister, Kathleen, had struggled with alcoholism at times. Some speculate that the call involved family stress, but no evidence has publicly confirmed the content of that conversation. The MapQuest directions found in her car led toward Burlington, Vermont, but she crashed 2 hours south of that location. Was she rerouting, lost, or was her intended destination somewhere else entirely? The stretch of Route 112 where the crash occurred is not a main highway. It is rural, winding, dark even during daylight in winter months. If she had intended to disappear voluntarily, choosing such an isolated road is curious, because while it offers seclusion, it also limits access to help. One theory suggests she panicked after crashing. Perhaps she had been drinking. Perhaps she feared legal trouble. She declined assistance from Butch Atwood. She may have fled into the woods to avoid police. If so, hypothermia is a possibility. February temperatures in that region can drop quickly after sunset, but extensive searches did not recover remains in the immediate area. Years later, further ground searches also failed to uncover definitive evidence. Another theory proposes that she accepted a ride from a passing motorist. If the scent trail ended on the road, it supports that possibility. But if she entered a vehicle voluntarily, who was driving? No confirmed witness has come forward identifying such a pickup. No known surveillance footage exists from that rural stretch in 2004. This was pre-smartphone era. No GPS tracking, no constant digital trace. Once she stepped away from that car, she stepped into absence. The Saturn itself revealed little beyond what was already known. Airbags deployed, windshield cracked, personal belongings inside. Her phone was not used after the crash. Call records show no outgoing or incoming calls in that final window. Her voicemail was not checked. There was no confirmed final text. Investigators have never publicly identified a suspect in her disappearance. No one has been charged. No body has been found. The silence following 7:46 p.m. that night has now lasted decades. Late at night, when this story unfolds slowly, the fear lies in transition, a moment between witness departure and police arrival. 10 minutes. Enough time to walk, enough time to hide, enough time to enter another vehicle, enough time to vanish. The snow that night likely preserved some footprints temporarily, but snow also shifts. Plows pass, wind covers impressions, and the longer a search is delayed, the more nature reclaims. Over time, Maura Murray's disappearance became one of the most dissected missing person cases in America. Online forums built timelines down to the minute. Podcasts interviewed witnesses. Armchair investigators proposed elaborate theories. But evidence has remained static. A crash, a witness conversation, a refusal of help, an empty car, and a scent trail that ends. As weeks passed after the disappearance of Maura Murray, the case began shifting from active search to enduring mystery.
The immediate area around Route 112 had been combed. Helicopters scanned from above. Ground teams walked grid patterns. Dogs traced and retraced scent lines. Nothing conclusive was found. When searches expand without results, focus often turns inward, toward the person who vanished. Investigators reviewed Maura's academic history. She had attended West Point before transferring to the University of Massachusetts Amherst. At West Point, she had been disciplined for shoplifting cosmetics from a store. There had also been a credit card misuse incident involving fraudulent charges for pizza. Neither offense suggested violent behavior, but they did suggest stress, impulsivity, or coping issues during certain periods. Friends described her as athletic, competitive, sometimes private. She ran cross-country. She was physically strong, accustomed to endurance. Some believe that if she entered the woods, she may have been capable of traveling farther than expected. But winter terrain changes capability quickly. Snowbanks along Route 112 were high, the forest beyond them uneven and dense. A fall, an injury, or simple disorientation in darkness could have altered everything. Her relationship at the time also drew scrutiny. She had been dating a fellow student. Reports indicate tension in the days leading up to her departure. Phone records show she had called her boyfriend multiple times shortly before leaving campus, but did not speak to him directly. Her emotional breakdown at work days earlier, the moment when she reportedly said only, "my sister," remains a pivot point. Was she overwhelmed by family issues, romantic stress, academic pressure?
The email claiming a death in the family suggests intentional misdirection. It was not an impulsive departure. She created space, a week of absence. That suggests planning, but planning for what duration? Short escape or permanent disappearance? Her father has consistently maintained that she would not voluntarily disappear without contacting family. He believes foul play is likely. He has pushed for continued investigation for years. Others argue that voluntary disappearance cannot be ruled out. But if she intended to disappear permanently, why crash the car? Why withdraw only $280? Why leave personal belongings behind? Why no confirmed financial activity after? The 10-minute window remains the tightest focus. Between 7:36 p.m., when Butch Atwood last saw her, and 7:46 p.m., when police arrived, something happened. Possibility 1, she fled into the woods and succumbed to exposure. Counterpoint, extensive searches did not uncover remains nearby. Possibility 2, she accepted a ride from a passerby voluntarily. Counterpoint, no credible driver has come forward. Possibility 3, she was forced into a vehicle. Counterpoint, no signs of struggle at the roadside were documented. Possibility 4, she staged the crash to begin a new life. Counterpoint, no evidence of new identity, no bank activity, no confirmed sighting in 2 decades. The scent dog trail ending on the pavement remains central. If accurate, it supports vehicle involvement. But scent tracking is not infallible. Weather, road salt, and passing cars distort trails. The alcohol in her vehicle adds another layer. Open containers were reportedly found. If she had been drinking, fear of DUI consequences may have influenced her decision to leave before police arrived. Panic can distort judgment. In rural darkness, panic can escalate quickly. But panic usually leads to mistakes that leave evidence. Here, there is almost none. In the years following, reported sightings surfaced sporadically. A young woman matching her description in Quebec, another in Florida. None confirmed. The passage of time complicates identification. Faces change, memories fade. Digital footprints are sparse from 2004. In modern cases, cell phone pings, GPS data, and security cameras create layered maps. In 2004, much of that infrastructure did not exist. The road itself offers limited surveillance. Nearby homes were few. Most did not have cameras. Traffic at that hour was light. A vehicle could stop briefly without drawing attention. If she entered another vehicle willingly, it may have felt like a temporary solution. If she entered unwillingly, the isolation favored the perpetrator.
The case's persistence stems from this balance between ordinary and extraordinary. Car accidents happen. Young adults take spontaneous trips. People panic after crashes. But people do not usually vanish entirely in 10 minutes. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the focus narrows to that roadside conversation. A bus driver offering help. A young woman declining. Snow crunching under boots. Breath visible in cold air. Headlights fading. Then quiet. When police arrived, the scene was static. The car, the snowbank, dark woods beyond. No footprints obvious. No sign of a second vehicle confirmed. Just stillness. Some investigators believe she may have walked east along Route 112 and been picked up beyond the initial search zone. If so, the abduction point may not align exactly with the crash location.
Others maintain she likely entered the woods within minutes and that terrain and time concealed remains. Private landowners have allowed searches repeatedly over the years. Ground-penetrating radar has been used. Cadaver dogs deployed again. Still, nothing definitive. The house nearest the crash was searched. So were outbuildings and surrounding acres. Each search revives hope. Each search concludes without resolution. The Maura Murray case sits in a unique space between crime and mystery. There is no confirmed homicide, no confirmed suicide, no confirmed voluntary disappearance, only a moment of transition in darkness. In the years since February 9, 2004, the stretch of Route 112 where Maura Murray crashed her car has changed very little. The road still curves through forest. Snow still piles along the shoulders in winter. Headlights still cut through darkness the same way they did that night. Drivers pass without realizing they are moving through one of the most enduring disappearance sites in modern American history. For Maura's family, time has not softened the questions. It has sharpened them. Her father has returned to the crash site repeatedly over the years. He has organized searches, met with investigators, pressed for expanded efforts. The absence of physical evidence has forced the case into speculation, but speculation is not proof. The official status remains simple. Maura Murray is missing. No confirmed body, no confirmed suspect, no confirmed sighting after 7:36 p.m. The theories have multiplied over 2 decades. Some believe she fled intentionally, overwhelmed by academic pressure, relationship strain, and personal setbacks. They argue that the packed dorm room, the withdrawal of cash, and the fabricated family death email suggest escape planning. But long-term voluntary disappearance leaves traces: employment, identification, financial activity, digital footprint. There is no credible evidence she built a new life elsewhere. Others believe she ran into the woods in panic and succumbed to exposure. Winter in northern New Hampshire can be unforgiving. Temperatures drop quickly after sunset. Hypothermia can set in within hours. But search teams covered the immediate area thoroughly within days. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Ground searches extended beyond the roadside. No clothing, no remains, no definitive trace. The scent dog tracking east along the pavement remains one of the most debated pieces of the case. If accurate, it suggests she stayed on the road briefly, and if the scent truly ended abruptly, it suggests vehicle involvement. But without eyewitness confirmation, it remains interpretation. A passing motorist theory persists. Perhaps someone stopped. Perhaps she entered willingly, seeking warmth or transport. Perhaps that decision sealed her fate. If so, the anonymity of a dark rural highway protected the person responsible. In 2004, there were no widespread dash cams, no automatic license plate readers, no smartphone location tracking. The technology gap matters. The world she disappeared into was less digitally recorded. The silence is not just physical, it is technological. Another possibility is accidental concealment. If she wandered further from the road than initial searches anticipated, natural elements may have hidden remains. Dense forest swallows objects quickly. Animals scatter evidence. Seasonal growth obscures the ground. But over 20 years, repeated searches have yielded nothing conclusive. What makes this case uniquely haunting is not violence confirmed, it is uncertainty sustained. There is no courtroom drama here, no confession tape, no suspect sitting in custody, just a timeline that narrows to 10 minutes. 7:36 p.m., witness leaves a roadside. 7:46 p.m., police arrive. In between, absence. Late at night, when this story settles into quiet, the focus returns to that conversation. A bus driver offering help, a young woman declining, snow reflecting headlights, cold air filling lungs. The sense that she did not want police involvement. Was that embarrassment, fear, desire to avoid consequences, or something else entirely? The case has inspired documentaries, podcasts, message boards, and amateur investigations. It has drawn thousands into analysis of weather patterns, map coordinates, and family interviews. But the core remains unchanged. A crashed car, a rural road, a missing person, and decades of unanswered questions. The most unsettling element may be this: there was no scream reported, no struggle witnessed, no visible urgency in her demeanor according to the last witness. She was described as calm, shaken but calm. If she entered another vehicle, it may not have felt like danger in that moment. If she walked into the woods, it may have felt transitory. If she intended to disappear voluntarily, it may have felt controlled. But from the outside looking in, control vanished quickly. The Maura Murray case represents the fragility of transition, the space between one decision and its consequence, between declining help and losing contact, between headlights fading and silence expanding. In crime storytelling, there are often definitive endpoints: arrest, conviction, confession. Here, there is none. Just an unresolved stretch of highway, snow absorbing footprints, wind erasing evidence, and a young woman who stepped away from her car and was never seen again. Thank you for listening.
The summer Los Angeles stopped sleeping. In the summer of 1985, Los Angeles stopped sleeping. Windows that once stayed open for night air were shut tight despite the heat. Porch lights remained on until sunrise. Gun sales increased. Neighbors began checking on one another before bed. The city did not know his name yet. They only knew the pattern. He came after midnight. He entered quietly, and he chose houses at random. The first confirmed killing connected to what would become known as the Night Stalker occurred in 1984, but it was in 1985 that fear truly spread. Victims ranged in age from young adults to the elderly. Some lived alone, some with spouses, some in modest homes, others in middle-class neighborhoods. There was no clear profile, no consistent income bracket, no predictable district, just entry through unlocked doors or windows, and then violence. He often approached on foot, dark clothing, sometimes a baseball cap, sometimes gloves. He carried firearms or knives depending on the night. He moved through houses like a shadow, silent until he wasn't. The randomness was what paralyzed Los Angeles. If criminals target specific neighborhoods, people adjust. If they target specific demographics, people rationalize. But when victims appear unrelated, when geography stretches across counties, fear multiplies. In March 1985, an elderly woman was murdered in her home. No forced entry. The attack was brutal. Weeks later, another elderly victim, then another. In some cases, jewelry was taken. In others, nothing of value disappeared. Sometimes there were signs of ritualistic behavior. Sometimes strange symbols were left behind. But at first, detectives did not immediately connect the crimes.
Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was vast and fragmented. Jurisdictions overlapped. Sheriff's departments handled some areas, city police handled others. Patterns are harder to see when data is scattered. It was only as cases accumulated that similarities emerged. Victims were often attacked while asleep. Windows left open for ventilation during warm nights, windows cracked open. Air conditioning was less common. The killer exploited routine. He watched neighborhoods in advance, studied which homes went dark first, which houses lacked security bars, which bedrooms faced side yards. He preferred darkness over confrontation, surprise over struggle. In one attack, a couple was assaulted in their bedroom. In another, a single woman. In yet another, an elderly man shot while asleep. The method varied slightly. The intrusion did not. The media began using the name the Night Stalker. The label intensified panic because it suggested someone moving through the city deliberately, someone hunting. Law enforcement faced mounting pressure. The killer left behind limited physical evidence. In one instance, a shoe print was recovered, an uncommon brand, size 11, Avia sneaker. That detail would later become critical, but at the time, it was just a clue without a face. In some crime scenes, investigators noted symbols drawn, pentagrams or references to satanic imagery. This fueled media frenzy. Talk radio amplified fear. Rumors spread. Parents forbade teenagers from staying out late. Security companies advertised aggressively. Gun ranges filled with first-time buyers. Los Angeles in 1985 was already grappling with crime waves and gang activity, but this was different. This was intimate. Home invasion erodes the illusion of safety more deeply than street crime. It reaches into bedrooms, into moments of vulnerability. Late at night, when ceiling fans turn slowly and houses cool down, silence becomes noticeable. That summer, silence became suspicious. In July 1985, a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen vehicle connected to one of the crimes. The print belonged to Richard Ramirez. He was 25 years old, a drifter, born in Texas, raised in an unstable household, exposed early to violence and disturbing influences. He had moved to California in his early 20s, living transiently, hotels, friends' couches, cheap apartments. He had prior arrests for theft and drug possession, but nothing that prepared the public for what would unfold.
Before his identity was known publicly, Ramirez continued attacking. Victims described a thin man with dark hair, sunken eyes, a strong odor, poor dental hygiene that some later recalled vividly. He sometimes demanded money, sometimes jewelry, sometimes simply entered and attacked without prolonged interaction. In certain attacks, he forced victims to swear allegiance to Satan. These details, reported widely, intensified media sensationalism. But beyond the shock value, the core pattern remained. He chose unlocked entries. He struck between midnight and 4 a.m. He fled before neighbors could react, and he left entire households terrified. The police began coordinating more aggressively between jurisdictions. Task forces formed. Ballistics reports linked firearms used in multiple attacks. The Avia shoe print appeared at several scenes. Detectives canvassed shoe stores, tracked recent purchases. The brand was not widely distributed. It narrowed possibilities.
But Los Angeles County holds millions of residents. The field was still vast. In late July 1985, 2 elderly women were attacked in Monterey Park. One survived. She provided a description that matched earlier witness accounts. The composite sketch circulated rapidly. It was broadcast on television, printed in newspapers, distributed to patrol officers. For the first time, the city saw a face. Thin, dark eyes, angular features. The effect was immediate. Tips flooded in, but many were false. Paranoia can distort identification. People began seeing the Night Stalker everywhere, in grocery stores, on buses, at gas stations. The real Richard Ramirez continued moving quietly, sleeping during the day, walking at night, sometimes taking public transportation, sometimes hitchhiking. He did not fit a polished criminal profile. He was erratic, addicted to cocaine, prone to impulsive decisions, but at night he demonstrated focus, selection, entry, exit. In August 1985, a major break occurred. Ramirez left behind a fingerprint on the rearview mirror of a stolen Toyota. This time it was clear. The print matched one already in the system from a previous arrest. His name became public. Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker had a face and a record. Police released his mugshot. Television stations aired it repeatedly. Newspapers printed it on front pages. The city's fear shifted from unknown predator to known fugitive. But that did not reduce danger. It intensified the hunt. Once the name Richard Ramirez was released to the public in August 1985, Los Angeles shifted from fear to pursuit. His face was everywhere. Television broadcasts interrupted programming with updates. Newspapers printed his mugshot in bold ink. Radio hosts repeated the name hourly. The anonymity that had protected him vanished overnight. But before the identification became public, the violence had escalated. In the weeks leading up to the reveal, Ramirez attacked repeatedly. Couples shot in their beds, women assaulted in living rooms, elderly victims beaten without warning. He did not follow a strict victim type. Age ranged widely, neighborhoods varied, income levels differed. This randomness made profiling difficult. The Avia shoe print continued appearing at scenes. Detectives tracked distribution records and learned that only a limited number of that specific model had been sold in the Los Angeles area. It was not mass-produced. The rarity helped narrow investigative focus, but it did not immediately produce a suspect. Then came the fingerprint, lifted from the rearview mirror of a stolen vehicle abandoned after one of the attacks. The print was clear, strong, undeniable. It matched an existing record for Ramirez from a previous arrest. For the first time, they had more than pattern. They had identity. But Ramirez did not know immediately that his name had gone public. He continued moving as if still invisible, staying in cheap motels, visiting acquaintances, traveling by bus between neighborhoods. When he finally saw his face on television in late August 1985, the manhunt shifted into something volatile. Los Angeles was no longer just frightened, it was alert and angry. Residents began watching strangers more closely. The composite sketch had already created suspicion. Now the confirmed photo made recognition possible. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles after a brief trip to Arizona. He stepped off a bus at the Greyhound terminal downtown. He did not yet know that his image was on every news broadcast. As he walked through East Los Angeles, residents recognized him almost immediately. Someone shouted, another pointed. Within minutes, a crowd began forming. This was not organized law enforcement. This was spontaneous public reaction. People chased him through streets. He attempted to carjack a vehicle. The driver fought back. He was struck by bystanders, beaten, held down until police arrived. The man who had stalked sleeping homes was captured in day broadlight by the very city he had terrorized. The image of his arrest became symbolic, not just police capturing a fugitive, but a community responding collectively. When officers arrived, Ramirez was bloodied but alive. He smiled at cameras, raised a hand with a pentagram drawn on it during court appearances later. But at the moment of arrest, the panic in Los Angeles began to shift into relief. Still, relief does not erase trauma. The list of victims was long. More than a dozen murders, multiple sexual assaults, numerous attempted killings. Survivors carried permanent scars, physical and psychological. Ramirez's pattern exploited something simple: unlocked windows during warm nights, routine, trust in domestic space. He did not need elaborate planning. He needed opportunity. He walked neighborhoods looking for vulnerability. A window slightly open, a door without deadbolt. He entered quietly, often through a rear entrance, sometimes by climbing. He moved through homes with surprising calm, demanding money in some cases, assaulting without warning in others. There was no consistent script. That unpredictability amplified fear. Some attacks included forced declarations of satanic allegiance. Ramirez embraced the label publicly after media began reporting it. He leaned into the image. Courtroom theatrics would come later, but during the summer itself, the horror was less theatrical. It was domestic. A husband shot beside his wife, an elderly woman beaten in her sleep.
A child awakened by gunfire. The Avia shoe became a symbol in its own right. Investigators distributed bulletins asking store owners about recent purchases. They cross-referenced receipts, interviewed clerks. The shoe print tied multiple scenes together conclusively. Without it, the crimes may have remained fragmented. Different jurisdictions might not have connected them as quickly. In the aftermath of his capture, law enforcement reviewed each scene meticulously. Ballistics evidence confirmed links between shootings. Fingerprint matches tied him to burglaries. Stolen items recovered. The picture sharpened. But for the residents of Los Angeles, the sharper image did not erase the months of fear. Parents remembered keeping lights on all night. Neighbors remembered forming informal watch groups. Some residents slept with weapons beside their beds. Security bars were installed across thousands of windows that year. Home alarm companies saw record demand. The Night Stalker had changed physical architecture in parts of the city. Metal bars became common in neighborhoods that previously left windows open. The psychological shift lasted longer than the crime spree. Late at night, the echo of that summer still feels present in the story. Because what Ramirez exploited was not wealth or poverty, it was routine. The assumption that midnight belongs to sleep, that windows can remain open for breeze, that quiet neighborhoods stay quiet. He moved between communities without prejudice, selecting houses based on accessibility rather than status. and that randomness created universal vulnerability. When the manhunt concluded with his capture, the city exhaled. But closure is never immediate. Each victim represented a separate rupture. Each surviving family carried memory into the future. And the city itself retained a lesson about darkness. To understand how the summer of 1985 unfolded the way it did, investigators eventually turned to the early life of Richard Ramirez. He was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability, violence, and exposure to disturbing influences at a young age. One of the most frequently cited influences was an older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who reportedly shared graphic stories of violence and combat. There were accounts that this cousin showed Ramirez photographs depicting brutality from the war. In at least one documented incident, the cousin shot his wife in front of Ramirez during an argument. Exposure to violence during formative years does not predetermine criminal behavior, but repeated exposure without stability can distort boundaries between imagination and action. By adolescence, he had already begun engaging in petty theft and drug use. He dropped out of school, moved frequently, drifted. His criminal record prior to the Night Stalker murders included burglary and narcotics charges. He was not a model citizen, but he was not yet publicly known as a violent offender. When he relocated to California in the early 1980s, he lived transiently. Cheap motels, friends' couches, occasional day labor. He developed a cocaine addiction. Substance use fueled erratic behavior, but also extended wakefulness, useful for someone who preferred to move at night. Ramirez did not conform to a single psychological category. He did not exclusively target one age group. He did not confine himself to one neighborhood. This unpredictability made profiling difficult. Many serial offenders demonstrate narrow patterns, specific victim types or locations. Ramirez's pattern was broader. His common denominator was vulnerability, unlocked doors, accessible windows, sleeping occupants. He exploited opportunity rather than personal grievance. The satanic symbolism reported at several scenes drew intense media focus. Pentagrams carved on skin or drawn on walls. Verbal references to Satan. In court later, he would flash a pentagram on his palm. But psychological experts have debated how much of this represented belief versus performance. Some argue that he adopted the symbolism as an identity, something dramatic and fear-inducing. Others believe it reflected a genuine fascination. Regardless of motivation, it amplified terror, because it transformed burglary into something ritualistic in public perception. But beneath the symbols, the core remained intrusion and violence. In many cases, he shot victims first to neutralize resistance. In others, he used knives or blunt force. Sexual assault occurred in several attacks, but not all. There was no singular script. The inconsistency itself increased unpredictability. Late at night, when ceiling fans spin and houses settle into silence, the randomness of his selection feels most unsettling. He did not stalk one person over months. He stalked entire neighborhoods, walking streets after midnight, observing which homes were dark, testing doors, lifting screens quietly. He carried firearms when available. If not, he used knives. If not, he used objects within reach. Improvisation was part of his pattern. The Avia shoe print
was one of the few consistent physical markers tying multiple scenes together. Investigators traced the shoe model to a limited retail distribution. When his arrest occurred, police found shoes matching the print in his possession. That link strengthened the chain of evidence. After his capture, detectives revisited earlier unsolved cases. Some earlier murders were reclassified as connected. The scope expanded. Ramirez's crime spree spanned roughly 14 months. The summer of 1985 was its most intense phase, but the fear it generated lasted far longer. Psychologically, Ramirez exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder: lack of remorse, manipulation, impulsivity. He reportedly smiled in court, made dramatic gestures, attempted to control the narrative. But courtroom performance is often superficial. The deeper pattern lies in behavior. He chose times when occupants were most vulnerable. He avoided confrontation during daylight. He fled quickly after assaults. He did not linger long at scenes beyond what was necessary to assert control. Despite media portrayals that leaned heavily into satanic imagery, the core behavior was opportunistic home invasion combined with extreme violence. That combination destabilizes communities because it turns the private sphere, the bedroom, into a site of fear. Los Angeles in 1985 became a case study in how serial crime reshapes urban behavior. Window bars increased. Neighborhood watch groups expanded.
Gun ownership rose. Even after his arrest, many residents kept lights on overnight for months. The Night Stalker became shorthand for vulnerability in darkness. For the victims' families, media attention offered little comfort. Names became headlines, faces circulated, but grief is not reduced by national awareness. Each home invasion was its own world shattered. Each survivor carried memories that extended far beyond the summer. In the broader narrative of American serial crime, Ramirez occupies a distinct place, not because he was the most methodical, not because he had the highest victim count, but because his attacks were spread across such a vast urban area in such a short time. The city felt under siege, and siege implies collective threat. After the arrest of Richard Ramirez in August 1985, Los Angeles did not immediately return to normal. Relief is not the same as restoration. The fear that had spread across neighborhoods did not evaporate overnight. Windows remained locked even during heat waves. Security bars stayed installed. Porch lights burned until dawn. The Night Stalker had changed behavior patterns permanently. For months, residents had gone to sleep wondering if their home would be the next one chosen at random. That randomness was the most destabilizing element. He did not confine himself to one block. He did not follow a predictable demographic pattern. He did not limit his victims by age. Children, elderly couples, young adults, anyone whose door or window offered opportunity. After his capture, police re-examined earlier unsolved burglaries and homicides across the region. Ballistics reports linked multiple shootings. Fingerprints confirmed connections. Stolen jewelry and personal items recovered from his possessions strengthened the chain of evidence. The shoe print, the size 11 Avia, remained one of the most significant physical anchors tying scenes together. Without that print, the crimes might have remained fragmented across jurisdictions.
Instead, it became a symbol of the investigation's turning point. During trial proceedings, Ramirez embraced notoriety. He flashed satanic symbols in court, smiled at cameras, attempted to project defiance. But courtroom theatrics do not change the pattern of behavior that defined the spree. The true weight of the case rests not in headlines, but in households. Bedrooms, once considered private, became scenes of violence. Couples who had slept with windows open for decades began installing steel bars. Entire neighborhoods coordinated informal patrols. The summer of 1985 entered collective memory as the season when Los Angeles did not sleep. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the most unsettling realization is how little separated safety from danger. An unlocked window, a thin screen, a sliding door without reinforcement. That was often enough. He did not rely on complex planning. He relied on accessibility. And accessibility exists in every city. In many serial cases, victims share characteristics. In this case, what they shared was vulnerability in routine. Sleeping, trusting the quiet, believing the door was secure enough. The cultural impact extended beyond Los Angeles. National news amplified the fear. Other cities reviewed cold cases. Homeowners across the country reconsidered security habits. The term Night Stalker entered popular vocabulary as shorthand for unseen threat after midnight. Yet beneath the media narrative lies a simpler and heavier truth. Lives ended violently in spaces meant for rest. Survivors carried trauma forward. Families rebuilt without answers that could restore what was lost. The randomness remains the defining feature. If there had been a clear grievance, fear might have been localized. But randomness dissolves boundaries. It tells every household, you could be next. That is why the case still resonates decades later. Not because of satanic symbols, not because of courtroom spectacle, but because it targeted the universal human need for safety in sleep. When the city captured him, not just police, but residents who recognized and chased him, it symbolized something larger, a community pushing back against prolonged fear. Yet fear leaves residue. Even after sentencing, even after incarceration, even after years passed, security bars remained on many windows installed that summer. The architecture of Los Angeles changed subtly because of him, and architecture is memory in metal. The Night Stalker case stands as a reminder that vulnerability often lies in routine, in small decisions, in habits repeated nightly, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators rely not on complexity, but on opportunity. When lights go out and houses settle, the illusion of safety feels natural. But in the summer of 1985, Los Angeles learned that illusion can fracture quietly. One window, one step inside, one city holding its breath. Thank you for listening.
The Murder of Martha Moxley, a Halloween night that never ended. On the night of October 30th, 1975, the Bellhaven neighborhood of Greenwich, Connecticut was quiet in the way wealthy enclaves often are. Tree-lined streets, large colonial homes set back behind trimmed hedges, private security at the gated entrance, a sense of insulation from the rest of the world. It was the night before Halloween. Teenagers called it Mischief Night, a night for harmless pranks. toilet paper in trees, eggs thrown at houses, laughter that echoed briefly before curfew. 17-year-old Martha Moxley had plans that evening. She had recently moved to Belhaven with her mother and brother. She was athletic, outgoing, adjusting to a new school and new social circle. Across the street lived the Skakel family, wealthy, well-connected, relatives of the Kennedy family. Their sons were part of the same teenage circle. That night, Martha left her home to join friends. Witnesses later placed her with the Skakel brothers, Thomas and Michael, and other neighborhood teens. They gathered outside, drank beer, roamed between houses. The atmosphere was loose but not violent. It was suburban restlessness, not danger. Around 9:30 p.m., Martha was last seen alive. She had reportedly left the Skakel residence intending to return home. Her house was only a short walk away, a few hundred feet across manicured lawns. She never made it inside. The next morning, October 31st, her mother noticed something wrong. Martha had not come home. Her bed was untouched. Calls were made, friends contacted. No one had seen her after the night before. By midday, a search began. It did not take long. Martha's body was found in her own backyard beneath a pine tree. She had been bludgeoned to death. The weapon was a golf club, specifically a 6-iron belonging to the Skakel family. The shaft had been broken during the assault. Part of it was found near her body. Another part was located near the Skakel driveway. The positioning suggested she had been attacked close to where she was discovered. She had suffered multiple blows to the head. The brutality shocked even seasoned officers. This was not a robbery. Her clothing remained intact. There were no signs of theft. The golf club, traced to the Skakel home, immediately shifted attention toward the house across the street. Police began interviewing teenage teens. The Skakel brothers gave varying accounts of their movements that night. Thomas stated he had returned home earlier. Michael initially claimed he had been inside the house watching television. Later, he offered different versions over time. The Skakel home itself was expansive. Multiple rooms, large property, access to golf clubs in a garage area. Investigators faced a delicate situation. The Skakels were wealthy and connected. Russell Skakel, their brother's father, was a relative of the Kennedy family. Political influence hovered in the background. From the beginning, some residents of Belhaven felt the investigation moved cautiously, perhaps too cautiously. In 1975, forensic science was limited. DNA profiling did not exist as we know it today. Crime scene preservation was less rigorous. Witness statements carried more weight, and teenage recollections after a night of drinking were inconsistent. Michael Skakel, 15 at the time, would later become central to the case. But in the immediate aftermath, no arrests were made. The murder remained unsolved. The image of Martha's body beneath the pine tree lingered in the community. A girl killed steps from her own back door in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in America. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling element is proximity. Her home was visible from where she died, lights likely still on inside, her mother unaware. Across the street, the house where the golf club originated stood silent. The murder fractured the illusion of safety in Belhaven. Security gates did not prevent violence. Wealth did not guarantee protection. The golf club itself became symbolic, an object of leisure transformed into a weapon, broken mid-assault. The force required to snap a club shaft indicates intensity, anger, loss of control, or calculated brutality. Years passed without resolution. Investigations reopened periodically. Private detectives hired.
books written, rumors circulated, but for nearly 2 decades, no one was charged. The case simmered beneath Greenwich's polished exterior, a cold case that refused to disappear. In the days following the murder of Martha Moxley, the Belhaven neighborhood of Greenwich did not erupt into chaos. It tightened. Conversations moved indoors sooner in the evening. The sense of insulation, the quiet belief that crime belonged elsewhere, fractured. But outwardly there was restraint. The Skakel home across the street remained occupied. Cars entered and exited as usual. The teenagers returned to school. The murder weapon, the 6-iron traced to the Skakel property, should have been the clearest lead. But proximity does not automatically translate to proof. Police interviews began with neighborhood teenagers. Accounts conflicted. Alcohol had been consumed. Memories blurred. Thomas Skakel said he had been with Martha earlier but parted ways before the night ended. Michael Skakel gave multiple versions of his whereabouts over time. At first, he reportedly claimed to have been inside the house watching television. Later, he said he had climbed a tree outside Martha's window that night, hoping to glimpse her. That admission surfaced years later. The detail unsettled investigators because it placed him physically near her home at a critical hour. Yet in 1975, those statements were not immediately leveraged into charges.
The Skakel family hired private investigators early in the process. This created an unusual parallel investigation. Interviews conducted by private firms, transcripts collected independently, law enforcement and private inquiry moving simultaneously. That dual structure complicated narrative consistency. Witnesses sometimes spoke differently to different investigators. Some teenagers later recanted earlier statements. Others claimed they felt pressured. One recurring thread was tension between Martha and one of the Skakel brothers earlier that evening. Reports suggested an argument, nothing violent, but emotional friction. The question lingered: did something escalate after she left their house? The crime scene itself offered limited forensic clarity. Martha had been struck multiple times. The blows were forceful. The broken golf club shaft indicated intensity. There were no eyewitnesses. No neighbors reported hearing screams. The homes in Belhaven were spaced far enough apart that a brief assault could occur unnoticed. The investigation stalled. Years passed. The case cooled. Then in the 1990s, momentum returned. A renewed grand jury inquiry began. New witnesses came forward. Among them were former classmates and acquaintances who claimed Michael Skakel had made incriminating statements during adolescence. Some alleged he had spoken about the murder casually. Others claimed he had hinted at involvement. One witness recalled Michael saying years later that he was concerned he might have done something and not remembered it. These recollections emerged long after the fact. Memory, especially teenage memory filtered through years of retelling, is fragile. But prosecutors began building a case. Michael Skakel, by then an adult, became the focal point. The theory centered on him following Martha after the gathering, possibly encountering her in her yard, possibly attacking her during a confrontation. But motive remained unclear. Jealousy? Rejection? Impulse? The lack of sexual assault evidence complicated motive analysis. The assault appeared focused on bludgeoning. Overkill suggests rage, but rage requires trigger. The case eventually led to Michael Skakel being charged decades after the murder. He was convicted in 2002, but the legal aftermath would stretch for years. Conviction overturned, appeals granted, conviction reinstated, then vacated again. The courtroom drama became complex, but at its core remains the night of October 30th. Late at night, when the story returns to that pine tree in Martha's yard, the wealth and politics fade. What remains is proximity. Her home visible from where she lay, a golf club taken from across the street, teenagers who had been laughing hours earlier, and silence that followed. The Skakel house stood across from the Moxley home like a mirror. Same manicured lawns, same brick facades,
but between them lay a body and a question that would not fade. As decades passed, the case became symbolic of privilege and power intersecting with justice. Some believed influence slowed the initial investigation. Others believed evidence was always too thin for certainty. What cannot be disputed is that Martha Moxley died steps from safety. Her killer, whoever it ultimately proves to be, was someone within reach, not a drifter, not a stranger passing through, but someone inside the gated enclave. And that realization unsettled Belhaven more than any external threat ever could. By the time the case against Martha Moxley reached court in the early 2000s, more than 25 years had passed since the night she was killed. Time alters evidence. It also alters people. Teenagers become adults. Memories calcify or distort. Rumors harden into narrative. Michael Skakel, once a 15-year-old boy in Belhaven, was now a grown man facing trial for murder. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from former classmates and acquaintances. Several witnesses claimed that during adolescence, Michael had spoken in ways that implied guilt. One former classmate testified that Michael once said something along the lines of, "I'm going to get away with murder." Another described conversations in which he allegedly expressed anxiety about being responsible for something terrible. These statements were not recorded at the time. They were recollections offered decades later. Defense attorneys challenged their reliability. Memory under pressure, especially memory revisited repeatedly over years, is vulnerable. Yet juries often weigh emotional testimony heavily. The prosecution argued that the golf club taken from the Skakel home was the key physical link. The 6-iron belonged to a set owned by the Skakel family. It was found broken near Martha's body. The broken shaft and club head were matched to that set. The implication was proximity and access. But proximity is not exclusivity. Many people in Belhaven knew one another. The Skakel property was not impenetrable. Still, the emotional weight of the club originating from across the street carried power. The prosecution's narrative suggested that Michael followed Martha after she left the Skakel gathering. Perhaps there was tension earlier that evening. Perhaps there was rejection. Perhaps there was adolescent anger. In this theory, the attack occurred quickly in her yard. Blows delivered in rapid succession. No extended struggle. No prolonged noise. A violent eruption in the dark. The defense countered with alternative possibilities. Thomas Skakel's whereabouts were questioned again. Other teenage attendees were scrutinized. The lack of physical evidence tying Michael directly to the scene was emphasized. There was no DNA evidence conclusively linking him. No eyewitness, no confession, just the broken golf club and long-delayed recollections. Michael Skakel was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to 20 years to life.
But the story did not end there. Years later, his conviction was overturned due to ineffective assistance of counsel. Appeals followed, legal rulings shifted, convictions reinstated, then vacated. The procedural journey became as complex as the original investigation. But beneath the legal oscillation lies a simpler truth. Martha Moxley was killed in her own yard. Someone in that gated community committed the act. The legal system has wrestled with who. Late at night, when the courtroom fades from focus, the emotional center returns to October 30th, 1975. The last confirmed sighting of Martha walking away from the Skakel house. Her house visible nearby, a few hundred feet. The sense of safety within sightline. Then the assault, the repeated blows, the broken club, the stillness beneath the pine tree. The wealth of Belhaven amplified scrutiny, because when violence occurs in affluent enclaves, it challenges assumptions. Security gates do not stop rage. Influence does not reverse blunt force trauma. Teenage impulsivity can exist in any zip code. Over time, the case became less about a single suspect and more about institutional tension. Did influence delay justice? Did early investigative missteps compromise clarity?
Did memory erosion weaken certainty? Cold cases often suffer from a cruel paradox. Time creates distance that may allow witnesses to speak more freely, but time also erodes accuracy. The human brain reshapes past events unconsciously. Conversations repeated become slightly altered. Certainty grows even as detail fades. For the Moxley family, the legal turbulence did not restore what was lost. Convictions overturned do not erase violence. Appeals do not reconstruct the final moments in that yard. What remains is a neighborhood that can never fully return to its former innocence, and a story that lingers because resolution remains unstable. Some believe the conviction was justified. Others believe reasonable doubt persists. The court record is layered. But in the quiet version of the story, the one told slowly, late at night, the focus remains on proximity and rupture. Two houses facing one another, teenagers laughing hours before, a golf club transformed from sport to weapon, and a body discovered on Halloween morning. The image has endured because it contradicts expectation. Violence in Belhaven was not supposed to happen. Not there, not among families connected to wealth and political lineage. But violence does not require poverty. It does not require broken windows. It requires only proximity and impulse. Over time, the narrative became layered with broader questions. Did early investigative caution protect suspects? Did influence shape initial direction? Or were the facts always too thin for certainty? The absence of definitive physical evidence continues to divide observers. Some believe the conviction was correct. Others believe doubt persists. But regardless of legal outcome, Martha Moxley's death altered the community permanently. The pine tree became a silent witness. The yards between the houses no longer felt neutral. The street, once just pavement connecting neighbors, became the distance between suspicion and grief. Late at night, when the story returns to October 30th, the unsettling element is not the courtroom. It is how small the space was. A few hundred feet, that is all. A walk that should have taken less than a minute. Instead, it ended in violence. There was no stranger climbing fences from outside Belhaven. If the prosecution theory holds, the killer was someone she had been with hours earlier. Someone familiar. Someone within the circle of safety. That is the fracture that lingers. Not randomness, but intimacy. The Martha Moxley case endures because it sits at the edge of certainty, close enough to feel solved, far enough to feel unsettled. And in the quiet hours, when the lights are off and the house is still, it reminds us of something simple and uncomfortable. Distance does not guarantee protection. Familiarity does not eliminate danger. And sometimes, the darkest moment happens within sight of home. Thank you for listening.